So my name is Darienne Lancaster, and thanks so much for having me today. It's amazing to actually be here amongst so many rockfish nerds. I feel like I have finally found my people. It's lovely. I'm not the only one anymore. So I recently completed my master's in the School of Environmental Studies with Dr. Natalie Ban. Just finished up last August. It was really great. And for my thesis, I looked at recreational fisher compliance in rockfish conservation areas, mostly around the Victoria area and the Southern Gulf Islands, right around Galiano. And so the other speakers have done a really great job yesterday of kind of setting up why rockfish are amazing and a lot of their conservation threats. So I'm just going to kind of buzz through the things that I would normally spend a little bit more time on. But if you do have any more questions at the end or throughout, feel free to ask me and I'll pause and explain a little bit more. But as of course we all know at this point, overfishing is a primary cause of human-induced marine degradation. And so marine protected areas and fisheries closures like rockfish conservation areas have become a really important tool in preserving these kinds of species from overfishing. These protected areas have been shown to be really effective at rebuilding fish stocks, especially when fishing activity is fully restricted in the areas or really greatly reduced. But as we've heard from a lot of great speakers, these areas really require high levels of compliance to the rules and regulations for them to have any impact on protecting marine species and habitats. You can imagine you can make these parks, but if people aren't following the rules or don't know what the rules are, it doesn't really matter that they're just kind of paper parks. However, internationally, quantitative assessments of compliance are really rare. And studies of recreational fishers in temperate marine waters, like the waters we have here in BC, are almost non-existent. And that's really problematic because despite the fact that recreational fishers usually aren't thought to take that much of the fish catch, they actually take 12% of the total global catch in the world every year. And the worst part of that is that it's usually coming from the most overfished environments because recreational fishers are convenience-based, so they go out right from their house into those shallow coastal environments that have been fished really heavily for a really long time. So they're really going into those very heavily fished areas. Yeah, John?
Marine and freshwater or just marine?
Just marine.
Just marine 12%.
Yeah. Yeah. So after yesterday, I'm sure, or I hope you're all convinced that rockfish do need protection in BC, and this is because we know they're really vulnerable to overfishing. They have a lot of biological characteristics that make them really vulnerable, and they were dramatically impacted by the development of a commercial fishery in the 1980s that peaked in the 1990s. As it stands now, yellow-eye rockfish have been reduced to 12% of their historic biomass from 1918. It's pretty dramatic. And quillback and yellow-eye rockfish are currently listed as either threatened or a species of special concern by COSUIC and SARA. And I just wanted to kind of address one of Jen's questions yesterday as well. She was trying to ask, like, why are rockfish important? What in the context of the marine environment? Why do we care about these guys? They're cute and they're old, and or maybe they're not cute. Maybe that's just me thinking. But I think they're adorable. Magnificent. But if they're pulled out of this environment, what's going to happen? There's 37 different species of these fish in just BC alone. So if you can imagine pulling out 37 different species on land, all of those animals just suddenly vanishing, you can imagine that would have a really big impact. Killer whales actually comprise part of their diet from rockfish, and sea lions, stellar sea lions, like eating rockfish. And they're really important for keeping those lower level animals in check, like crustaceans and prawns, so that they don't start taking over the environment. So they're those kind of mid-level predators that are making sure that everything's balanced. So there's 37 different species. They're pretty important in a lot of different ways, kind of in that middle area of the environment.
Thanks for that, because it's not like I care about them, but I'm very.
You want to be able to say why they're important.
It's about people who aren't convinced that conservation for conservation's sake.
Exactly.
You want to have some bit of factual information to give them that's going to engage, right? And convince people who aren't already convinced.
Yeah, perfect. So here's a map of the RCAs that we've seen a bunch already in the last couple of days. These are the ones that I primarily looked at. These are the ones around Galiano Island. And these kinds of really small fisheries closures are thought to be pretty good for rockfish because, as we heard yesterday, they have small home ranges. They often stick to a single boulder site for their entire lives. So if you make a little conservation area around their boulder, you're going to protect that rockfish forever. However, as I mentioned before, compliance is key. If someone goes in to their little protected boulder area and fishes it, that rockfish is gone. So from a compliance angle, commercial fishing in RCAs is very well monitored. There's people on board monitoring all their catch. There's GPS monitoring to make sure they're not going into RCA boundaries. So from a compliance angle, commercial fisheries are not a huge issue at this point. However, in the Strait of Georgia, which is the colored area on the map, there's kind of a trifecta of issues going on. First of all, it's the location of 2/3 of the Rockfish Conservation Areas. All the red spots on the map are the Rockfish Conservation Areas, so you can see it's absolutely littered with them throughout the strait. Secondly, it is also the area where rockfish are most critically threatened. This is a really heavily fished area. It's been fished and used for a long time by people, so there's a lot of impacts in this area. And finally, it's one of the most intensive recreational fishing areas, and DFO doesn't really have a lot of resources to expend on monitoring this section. And that's really unfortunate because actually 90% of the total rockfish catch, including commercial, is coming from the recreational sector. So there's not a lot of rockfish fishing in this area, so 90% of the rockfish that are coming out of the strait each year is coming from recreational fishermen. So knowing all that and building upon Dana's study, I wanted to look at recreational compliance and figure out how much people know about RCAs and how much non-compliance is actually going on out there and why non-compliance is happening. I just wanted to know what the heck is going on out there. So to do that, I had a couple of research goals. First of all, I wanted to directly address this problem of suspected recreational non-compliance in conservation areas. And then more generally, I wanted to explore some new methods for assessing non-compliance. I had a couple of objectives to get this job done. First of all, I assessed ecological and social RCA effectiveness using a framework for improved governance from the literature on common pool resources. Kind of boring, but actually very useful. Then I also assessed recreational fisher knowledge and perceptions of RCAs, and then I quantified the amount of non-compliance. And I looked at social and ecological compliance drivers in RCAs, basically figuring out what's making people fish in these areas if they are. So to assess the current effectiveness of RCAs, I conducted a literature review of all the existing studies. This looked at a lot of studies that Dana did especially, and Brian Cloutier. A bunch of people have been studying them for a while. These studies looked at rockfish recruitment in the rockfish conservation areas. They used remote operated vehicles. They did scuba surveys. They looked at trophic cascades, whether lingcod are eating up all the rockfish or not. And then I used something called the design principles for effective management of common pool resources. Common pool resources are like fisheries. They have a lot of people coming in and using them and sharing the resource. And I wanted to see where the design and management of RCAs is currently doing well and where it can be improved. So the design principles were basically based on the question, what types of rules are most successful in sustaining the productive use of common pool resources? So key principles include things like clear boundaries, so people have to know where the conservation area starts and ends and what the rules are in those areas. Resource monitoring, you need some really consistent monitoring of what's going on in the areas. You need to know what the fish are doing in there and whether or not they're rebuilding. And user monitoring, obviously you need to be monitoring the people, the fishermen who are using it, and making sure you know what's actually going on and whether they're following the rules. So unfortunately, when I did this assessment of the 11 different principles, I found that 9 of the 11 key design principles for effective systems were missing for the recreational sector in the management of RCAs, which really points to some key issues, some areas that could really could be improved upon in the management of RCAs. So most importantly, I suggested that first of all, we need consistent ecological monitoring throughout all of the RCAs. And most importantly, a decadal review process should be implemented. This would allow DFO to actually go back. They did a really great job of implementing these really quickly. At least something got done. You heard about the National Marine Conservation Area, which has been taking decades. So at least they're there. But we want to go back and kind of start improving upon them and see what happened when we put them in that's not doing as well as it could be. So then for my second objective, I went out, and this was the fun bit, and I went out and I assessed recreational fisher knowledge and perceptions of RCAs. So to do this, I used structured survey questions. And I used 6 open-ended questions at the end of the surveys to kind of assess people's perceptions of the RCAs. These are all my survey locations. Me and my lovely research assistant Kaya Bryce went out in the summer of 2014. We went all the way up to Vancouver, all through the Gulf Islands, all the way down to Souk. Covered a lot of ground. We did 325 surveys with fishermen. And from these surveys I got some really informative numbers about what's going on in the RCAs. First of all, over 25% of people had never even heard of an RCA. Approximately 60% of fishers weren't even confident of where RCA locations were. So even if they knew where they were like, oh, but, or even if they knew they existed, they didn't actually know where they were. And 40% of fishers believe that salmon fishing is still permitted in RCAs, and 23% believe that halibut fishing is still permitted. In actuality, these are full hook and line closures. I also asked some questions about knowledge of RCA regulations, and 44% of fishers didn't know a single RCA regulation, and less than 1% had a perfect knowledge of the rules. I also asked some questions about recreational bycatch of rockfish. So these are fish that fishers are going out and accidentally catching when they're targeting something else like salmon. First of all, I found that less than 2% of fishers had ever redescended rockfish after capture. Now, redescending rockfish is a practice that's been shown to dramatically improve their chances of survival by recompressing their overexpanded swim bladders. It's kind of like if a diver gets the bend, you throw them in a hyperbaric chamber and drop them back down with pressure. And then that's exactly how this works. You throw them back down with a weighted line, drop them back down to the depth they're normally living at, and it recompresses the gases in their swim bladder. So these devices will auto-release when it reaches a certain depth. However, they're pretty inexpensive, but almost nobody knew about them. Less than 1% of people had ever even heard of a redescending device. Yeah.
Have you seen the awesome sea hawk video?
I don't think I have. You'll have to show me.
There's a wrap and everything.
Oh, I totally have. It's possibly the nerdiest video ever made. There's a rap about sequelizers and redescending rockfish. It's great. So then I asked some more questions about the number of fish that are being caught. Fishers accidentally caught an average of 14 rockfish in the past 2 years, which really doesn't sound like that much. But for some general context, there were 307,157 recreational fishing licenses sold for the marine waters in BC. And now, not controlling for regional variability of people who only fish for crabs, that means that there were nearly 1.5 million rockfish accidentally caught in BC in 1 year alone from recreational fishing. And that also doesn't include the number of rockfish that are intentionally caught each year. That's only the accidentally caught ones. And this means that many of these rockfish are probably dying as well when they're pulled to the surface because people don't know about redescending them. So they're just throwing them back on the surface where they often get picked off by seagulls or seals. There is some good news though, thank God. Based on the open answer questions I had, overall fisher perceptions of rockfish conservation areas are quite positive. 77% of survey respondents think that rockfish conservation is necessary in BC, which is great. This is really crucial for creating marine protected areas with high compliance. If people aren't on board, you can't even get that high compliance. So people are into it, maybe they just don't know about them. And additionally, 55% of survey participants think people are fishing in RCAs just because they don't know about them. However, I should mention that the other 36% think that people are fishing in there as poaching. So the fishers I spoke to also offered some really great suggestions on how to improve, which I'll get to in just a little bit. But first of all, my final objective was to quantify non-compliance and figure out why people are not following the rules. So to do this, I again used my structured surveys, and I also used some really awesome trail cameras, which I attached to trees around the Gulf Islands. So from my survey results, I found that obviously compliance is low. This isn't surprising at all based on the low levels of knowledge I found out about. We found an accidental non-compliance rate of 16%, so that means people who went in there not knowing that RCAs exist and fished in there. And then I found an intentional rate of 7%, which puts the total non-compliance rate up to almost 25% in RCAs. This is a really serious number. That kind of non-compliance could really jeopardize the ability of RCAs to be rebuilding rockfish stocks. So I also wanted to try and understand what makes people non-compliant. So I used generalized linear models to test a bunch of social compliance variables like how long you've been fishing, where you get your fishing information, how old you are, and the amount of time you spend fishing rockfish. However, none of these variables actually predicted increased compliance or knowledge in any way, shape, or form. I also used a hierarchical cluster analysis to figure out if there were certain groups that had higher levels of knowledge or understanding of the RCAs. So I did find 3 different groups. I found there was average fishers, novice fishers, and experienced fishers. However, levels of compliance and knowledge were similarly low amongst all of these groups. So this really means that fishers are uniformly unknowledgeable about rockfish conservation areas and their regulations. It's not just the new people starting out that don't know about them, and it's not just the old timers who think they know everything, so they're not even looking at regulations anymore. It's everybody. Nobody's really knowing about these things. So then I also use these great shore-based trail cameras, which the Galiano Conservancy has been using in follow-up years as well. You just strap them to trees. We had one actually here.
Spying on us on our beaches?
Not spying, they're really low resolution.
We're gonna start doing really dirty things.
I have had people do some pretty funny things in front of the cameras. I had some little girls who moved me. So we had trail cameras. So we have these trail cameras set up overlooking the ocean, so your beaches should be okay, Jen. And we had these set up July and August in 2014. This is all the areas that were monitored. This actually shows kind of a gradient of fishing pressure, the amount of time people spend fishing in these areas. The red spots are places that had the highest level of fishing, and green is places where nobody fished at all. So I had 40 different sites throughout the Gulf Islands and around Victoria, and these cameras would take a picture every 5 minutes all day long. And so I monitored 31 RCA locations, and 9 areas outside were used as comparison sites. And of the RCAs that I monitored, 79% of them showed evidence of poaching. So given my survey results, again, these are not surprising numbers. However, this means that RCAs can't adequately be protecting rockfish if 1 in 4 fishers are fishing in over 3/4 of RCAs. So I also used some mixed effects generalized linear models to test if fishing effort in RCAs was less than compared to our unprotected reference sites that are not protected. I found that there was actually no significant difference in fishing effort across these areas. So that means that boats are just fishing in the unprotected waters and then drifting right into the protected areas because people don't know about them. So these invisible RCA boundaries aren't stopping people who either don't care or don't know about these RCAs. So I also wanted to use some of these generalized linear models to test ecological compliance influencers. Is there something about the bottom type or kelp presence that makes people target specific areas? Because that might be able to help us kind of redesign rockfish conservation areas to avoid target spots. So I looked at substrate, which is bottom type, rugosity, how bumpy it is, kelp bed presence, and depth. And I did find that there was a greater correlation of more fishing happening at greater depth in RCA sites. Now, I don't want to place too much weight on this because the model didn't explain much of the variance. However, it is important to touch on the fact that barotrauma for rockfish is a lot more severe at greater depth. So if fishing hotspots are happening in RCAs that are really deep, this means that the rockfish that are accidentally pulled out of there or intentionally pulled out of there are going to be suffering a really terrible barotrauma because they're coming up from greater depth. So I also did a really cool study where I compared my trail camera findings to Dana's study from yesterday that you heard about, where she had all that aerial flyover data. And I wanted to compare and see if trail cameras were a good way of actually monitoring compliance, and if I got similar results to Dana's 2011 data. So I did find that there was no significant difference in a standardized mean monthly fishing effort between the two methods. So that means that both methods, both airplanes flying over and having someone count and having a trail camera strapped to a tree, are pretty much equally good for assessing compliance in really near-shore coastal environments. So this is really promising news for trail camera monitoring because it's really affordable, easy to set up, and quite easy to analyze the data. Yeah, Patty?
And I just wanted to mention that it has an interesting side effect on people's mentality and psychology as well, because I've had people approach me about seeing cameras And they're like, you know, oh no, people are watching the water, so all of a sudden there's this idea that maybe there actually is some kind of.
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword. People really don't like feeling like they're being watched and not being trusted, but at the same time, I have all these people saying that they want more monitoring, and if they feel like there is a presence out there that's concerned about conservation. I will say that I had tags on all the cameras explaining what the project was for and had my contact information if anyone was concerned. So that's actually a really great way to get people kind of involved, and if they see a camera, people want to figure out what's going on, and then they'll suddenly be like, oh, what's a Rockfish Conservation Area? So another great way to get the message out, scare them with a camera.
Did you have a map? Is that associated?
I didn't, I should have, but I did have a link to, maybe I didn't have a link to the Rockfish Conservation Area. So, anyway, I should have. So as I mentioned before, the fishers I spoke with had the opportunity to suggest ways we could improve rockfish conservation areas, and they came up with some really excellent and straightforward solutions. Most straightforward was their suggestion to shoot anyone who fishes in a rockfish conservation area. Haven't used that one yet.
I like that one.
Yeah. But
The best
seriously,
idea.
they actually did say shoot people. But they also suggested that, first of all, people need advertising and signs. They wanted more signs out at marinas and at boat launches and advertising about RCA rules and regulations. The Galiano Conservancy has been doing a great job following up on this particular recommendation. So one fisher told me, the DFO website is bad. The information is bad too.
Only one?
It's too hard. This is my best quote. It's too hard to understand. We need postings on marinas, an area-specific regulations booklet, and an app with RCA notifications. So coming to the app, many fishers recommended this. There's some really promising developments on this front. DFO and some UVic researchers like John Volpe, I know, is trying to work on this. We're trying to get Google Maps to put RCA boundaries into their mapping program, so that would allow you to have your location on your phone and you'd see, oh, I'm drifting into a rockfish conservation area. And I think Dana mentioned this yesterday, DFO is also starting to make their website information really more accessible so that app developers can have a live time update app that, you know how they're constantly changing fishing regulations. This one will actually update onto your app so you can actually have it with you. So they're working on developing that. They're a little bit behind the times, but things are happening, which is exciting. People also said they want more education for fishers. They suggested a mandatory knowledge test before being given a fishing license, which I think would be great. And they want fisheries and oceans officials out on docks explaining why these conservation areas exist and why rockfish need protection. And I want to take a little bit of a side jag here because I read a really fantastic paper recently by Schultz et al. It just came out in February. And it's on the challenges educators face when communicating information on ocean health to the public. And I thought I'd really briefly share with you some of the highlights from that article, since all of us seem to have a bit of an ocean education component to our lives, it seems. So learning how to create better information that can actually shift perspectives, I think, is really important to hear about. So they identified 3 main challenges to changing people's perspectives and raising concern about marine issues. First of all, they said that there is psychological distance. So most people, these are your typical people who are not working on ocean projects all the time, they feel psychologically distant from the oceans. So this can be spatial, so actually physically. People don't live close to marine environments, so they don't see and feel the impacts of marine issues. And even if they do live close, they often don't spend much time around the ocean, so it's really foreign to them. And it can also be temporal. People tend to, from all these surveys that they've done with people think that these marine conservation problems are something that's going to be happening in the future, when actually it's something that's happening right now. So in order to kind of overcome these challenges, it's really important, and the authors suggest that using technologies like interactive underwater video that can be sent into inland environments where people can actually ask questions of scuba divers, ask questions about what's going on. These are really important technologies to share the marine environment and make it become a real place, not just some random slab of water. And it's also really important to emphasize the immediacy of marine changes, such as rockfish population declines. Those are happening right now, and they've been happening for a while. And you need to do it in a really accessible way. You need to do things like interview a fisherman with a video and talk about the changes that they have seen over time in their lifetimes, so that they know that these are things that are changing right now, not things that are going to be a problem in the future.
Wear a hat.
wear a hat, a rockfish hat. Secondly, the psychological concept is unfamiliarity, pretty simple to understand. Inherently, we're terrestrial, land-based creatures, so the marine environment is totally foreign to us. So unless you're a scuba diver or you handily own a submarine, most people don't really get the chance to go down into these marine environments. Do you own a submarine? Good, this like cheeky smile, like I do. So as humans, we're really most concerned about land. So in these really fantastic surveys they did with people, people consistently ranked coastal erosion as the greatest threat perceived to the oceans. And that's because we live on land, so we're like, oh god, there's coastal erosion, that sounds terrible. But there's really, compared to things like ocean acidification and things like that, it's much less of a problem. So we really think about things in a terrestrial mindset. So a really great way to do this is to use metaphors that link marine concepts to terrestrial concepts. And Alexandra Barron actually did a fantastic job of that yesterday. I was like, oh, woot! She was talking about marine connectivity. And she said that we all know about wildlife corridors between parks. We've all heard about that. But people tend to think about the ocean as this big bucket of water, and fish can just go wherever they are. So she mentioned her metaphor was that we need these wildlife corridors underwater as well between the marine protected areas. So that's a fantastic example of using terrestrial concepts to link to marine environments. And finally, a big one is politicization. So conservation issues, especially marine conservation issues, can often really suffer from politicization. As soon as you bring politics into it, or really kind of political heavy terms like climate change, unfortunately, is one of those words that really gets people's hackles up into certain situations, people just really stop listening. So to overcome this, the authors suggest using things like framing marine issues as a public health concern rather than a political or moral issue. As soon as you turn it around so that it's actually, you're learning how this is going to impact you as a human, people's ears start to perk up and they really start to pay a little bit more attention. So overall, we know it's really difficult to educate people about marine issues, but considering tactics like this can make marine communication much more effective, and it should be something we start considering when we're developing our outreach posters and developing our education campaigns. So swimming all the way back to what people want for RCAs. They want more monitoring. I was really surprised to talk to all these salty sea dogs who actually said that they want people checking up on them more often. I did not expect that. So they wanted DFO official monitoring if possible, but a lot of people are aware that that's not really possible or hasn't been happening in any case. So they're suggesting a fisher-to-fisher monitoring campaign where people who know about it go out and tell the other people, hey, you're fishing in this area, did you know this existed? That kind of thing. One respondent said, we should encourage self-reporting. DFO just doesn't have the budget, we need community monitoring. People also suggested DFO make a few high-profile charges and big fines with confiscations to set a precedent. Another man stated, we need bigger fines and we need to take their boats. A few big cases like that will get people talking, which is very true. And finally, this is my suggestion based on countless hours of talking to fishers. DFO should consider renaming the RCAs to discourage salmon and halibut fishers from accidentally fishing there. It was really terrible. I was talking to all these really experienced fishermen who just pride themselves on knowing the regulations, and when I asked if they wanted to do a survey, they're like, yeah, try me. I got this. They know their stuff. But then I asked if they'd ever fished in these areas, and they're like, oh yeah, I fish for salmon in there all the time. Because it's called Rockfish Conservation Areas, anyone who's not targeting rockfish, they tend to turn off their ears and they're saying, oh, rockfish doesn't apply to me, I can fish in there. I'm fishing for salmon. So they really need to either change the name or make the regulations much more clear up front, something like hook and line closures in rockfish conservation areas. Something really simple like that could make a huge difference, I think. So overall, I have a few general recommendations for RC improvement. DFO should implement a decadal review process so that we can start strengthening some of the weaknesses that currently exist in the management of RCAs. There needs to be large-scale ecological assessments consistently applied across all of the RCAs so we actually know what's going on in there. And to assess if RCAs are even in appropriate locations. Dana's been doing a really great job with some of this work, but we need to continue it. And overall, as you can see, education and enforcement really needs to be enhanced for the recreational sector to cut down on this really high levels of non-compliance that could be negating the effects of RCAs on rockfish stocks. I have a couple of big picture contributions as well. I've got this fantastic new method for shore-based conservation. So the camera monitoring is really effective. This is great for NGOs with limited budgets. These cameras only cost about $200 each, and they can be left out for a couple of months at a time if you want. You can just go in and change the batteries once a month. And the analysis is really quite easy, so that cuts down on the cost of having airplanes flying over boats or paying people out on boats to be counting. So it's really effective for small coastal marine protected areas, and it's a really easy method to adapt for a whole bunch of other types of studies as well. And my project also emphasizes the need for more research on recreational fishing in general. It's continuously overlooked, although they do actually have pretty large cumulative impacts on fish stocks internationally. And finally, I think my study highlights mostly that effective outreach is really crucial when you're creating a marine conservation area. It's great that these RCAs exist, but if people don't know about it, it's just frustratingly, why do we even create them then? So I'd like to quote the lovely marine biologist and explorer Sylvia Earle when she says, "People need to know. You can't care if you don't know, and most people simply don't know." Knowledge doesn't always make people care about an issue, but if you don't even know about the issue, you don't even have the choice to care or not care. So we need to get the knowledge out there to people. And with that, this little quillback rockfish brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you so much, Jenna and Patty, for hosting. It's fantastic to be here again. And happy to take any questions.